Welcome to the Distinguished Physical Education Podcast. This is Gary Zaharatos. My guest today is Brian Hull. Brian taught secondary physical education in Title I schools for 10 years in Denver Public Schools before becoming a full-time member of the SPARK and Gopher Sport team. Brian currently works as an instructional coach at a middle school in Adams County, Colorado. In 2018, Brian received the SHAPE Colorado High School Teacher of the Year Award, and in 2020, Brian was named the SHAPE America National High School Teacher of the Year. And now I bring you Brian Hull. You ready, Coach?
Let's do it.
All right, so today we're going to be talking a little bit about equity in PE, and we asked teachers some questions, and they had some things that they wanted us to clear up when it comes to the differences between equity and equality in PE. So this question can be for both of us. Can you define equality and equity in general terms before providing examples in PE? You want to take one of those, and I'll try to take the other one?
Yeah, I can do equality. As you mentioned, Gary, there's a really big difference, but also similarity between equity and equality in physical education. Now, I'm going to go over the equality piece. In physical education, again, just like in real life, equality focuses on giving everybody the same things. So in physical education, if I'm teaching a basketball unit and everybody has a basketball, yes, that's equality, but Gary, you can chime in once you hit the equity piece. It doesn't mean every student's going to be successful with the same type of basketball, the same size of basketball, balls with the similar bounce. It needs to be different. So equality, they all have the same thing, but there's a big difference between having the same thing and having what a student needs. So segue into equity, Gary.
When I think of equity, just in general terms, it means providing students with the different types of support that they need. Not that everybody has the exact same resources or is playing a game by the exact same rules. We know that people and students have a lot of different needs. So let's talk about some things that we can do as PE teachers to provide students with an equitable experience as opposed to one that is just equal for everybody. You want to run with that basketball example?
I mean, in just a general basketball unit, again, we're going to get to rigor and differentiation later on during this conversation, but to have equitable teaching practices, a lot of times they do go hand in hand where differentiation plays a key role in that. So if I'm teaching a basketball unit, if I have a varsity basketball player in my class, along with a student who has never even dribbled a basketball before, well, equity is challenging each student where they're currently at, where equality is they both have a size 6 or a size 7 basketball. My job is not done there. My job is to make sure varsity basketball player and student who's never played before both can feel a sense of success. And to do that, I might give this student a larger basketball, maybe more inflated so it has an easier time bouncing, where I might give the varsity basketball player specific instructions, maybe dribbling with the non-dominant hand, maybe dribbling with his or her eye closed. That's equity, because if I had this student doing that, they would never be set up for success, never had being practicing basketball before even exposed to it.
Yeah, I love the connection between equity and differentiation. One of the terms that we use in Denver, you'll be familiar with this one, is called productive struggle. So again, it's about providing students with those opportunities in order to experience success while at the same time experiencing a little bit of struggle. You mentioned that we could provide students with different types of equipment. So that would be one, different types of basketballs. Other things that we can do to differentiate and provide a more equitable experience would be to change target sizes. Did you have any experience with that in your gym?
Yeah, I did. So, of course, in my gym, I had 6 basketball goals or hoops, but a lot of times for my lower level skilled students, I would just tape up boxes on the wall, and I would just have them focus on elevating their shot to that target, which, of course, the height was maybe 7 feet instead of your standardized 10 feet. And a lot of times some people think it's almost rocket science to have equitable teaching practices or to differentiate well. Sometimes it's the easiest things. And to your point, Gary, productive struggle, even though it might be easy for a varsity basketball player to just shoot a basket 8 feet into the air, for a student who's never been exposed to basketball, it was rigorous and they were really productively struggling with that task.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great example. And you're right, it's not rocket science. Oftentimes what it comes down to is the teacher having like a customer service mindset, right? By asking students what it is that they need in order to experience success, teachers can more easily modify activities. There's a couple of examples that I see when it comes to games themselves. I've seen teachers make up rules to games where if you make a basket, it could be worth 3 points. If you just hit the rim, it might be worth 2 points. And if you're able to just shoot and use somewhat proper form, we don't want kids just chucking the ball from the 3-point line. But if you can even just hit the backboard with a shot, you get awarded a point for that. So I think there's just lots of different ways to differentiate a game like basketball. And of course, we could use these modifications across other activities as well. But these are some great ones that would allow students to struggle while still experiencing success.
Yeah, I agree. And again, it goes back to the whole term equitable, where the students can all be playing in the same game, but I like their modification of rules to where one of those modifications are going to make any and all students feel a sense of success and cause them to be eager of wanting to take a shot because there's something in it for them.
Yeah, and then as opposed, we could draw a little bit of a contrast here. It wouldn't be an equitable experience if every student was just playing regulation games of basketball. What might some students feel like if we had 5-on-5 games going on, and the two students who you mentioned earlier, the student who might be a varsity basketball player and the student who has, the only time they've ever picked up a basketball has been in their PE classes over the last, 8 or so years for a couple weeks out of the year. What could that potentially look like if those two kids are playing in the same regulation type basketball game?
Yeah, I mean, first off, neither student's going to get anything out of it. Varsity player's going to have no challenge, where student who's never played before is going to almost be intimidated, and it's never going to want to make them even play or participate in basketball again. So one of the equitable things I like to do at times, and I don't always think this is appropriate, it almost depends on the unit, but sometimes I would do intentional ability grouping where I would maybe have all novice basketball players playing in the same game with one another and having a competitive game over here. It usually did one of two things. One, these players who again play on a regular basis were having fun, highly engaged, but had a challenge, while these students, they were able to fail and productive struggle without having to worry about anything because they were all in the same boat.
I like what you said too about one of the end goals is just to get kids to enjoy physical activity. So if we allow students to do something like choose into a modified version of a game, it seems like they're much more likely to enjoy the game that they're playing, as opposed to a novice student at a particular skill being thrown in there with someone who's relatively experienced. We know that they're not going to feel really very inclusive in that activity.
Yeah, and again, it goes back to like the whole physically literacy term where you're going to see people playing pickup games at the park, but you're also going to see people just dribbling or shooting a basketball. Both are more than acceptable. It's just what is challenging to you, and to your point, what's more enjoyable to that specific person.
Yeah, it seems like that could even be one of the courts. So if we're thinking about an equitable experience for everyone and providing students with opportunities to be appropriately challenged, we could have one game where we're playing by, mostly regulation basketball rules, and students could self-select. They could choose into that game. We could have a game in the middle where we use, rules like I mentioned earlier, hitting the backboard gets a point, etc. We could even have a third court where students are practicing their skills. Maybe they're practicing their different types of passes, playing keep away. Maybe there's a dribbling obstacle course that students can work on the dribbling skill. So I think having that other option that's like heavily modified for students who just they don't feel like participating in any type of competitive game. I think that has a big impact on their participation levels as well.
Well, and you bring up a good point, Gary, because this is something you and I worked on when you were observing me a few times, where if my lesson for the day was organized games of basketball, I'm just going to keep this example going, and I was really looking for them to explain and demonstrate the correct way of shooting while playing in the game. Well, oftentimes students would come up to me not wanting to play in a game. And I was okay with that as long as they were able to articulate with me what can they do instead of a game to where they can still meet those indicators in the objective. And to me, that's very equitable, but it causes more engagement to where it's almost a student is picking their own journey and it's still standards and objectives based.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I think it has an impact too outside of just that one particular lesson, because you could imagine a student who doesn't feel quite comfortable being thrown into the deep end, playing a regulation game with other experienced players, and how they carry that over from one lesson to the next. So student who might not be looking forward to PE the next day now is going to show up at your gym door knowing that they're going to have different options in order to participate. They're not just going to have to play that regulation game. They're going to have other options to be able to show their skills and show that they're making progress towards that objective.
You often refer to outdated, inequitable practices to modern ones, and we've already been really speaking about some of the modern ones, but can you give us some more specific examples of a modern example versus something that is more really old school way back in the day?
Yeah, when I was writing that in the first chapter, I had I think about 12 examples that I detail in there. Maybe we could just go over a couple of them and detail what some modifications might be to bring them from inequitable, outdated practices into more modern ones. The first one that comes to mind are elimination games. All of these things are so heavily intertwined that you and I have been talking about. When we think about elimination games, we think about students who need the physical activity the most, students who might end up being the most hesitant or at least less confident to just jump in and play. And when they do, they're either tagged or whatever the situation for the game is, and almost immediately they're eliminated. They're out of play, and they just have to sit there and watch their friends. So I think it ties back into differentiation in a sense, in that if we don't provide students with opportunities to continuously be active, we're going to discourage them from wanting to be physically active for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, I agree. And in my classes, I would do some elimination based games. However, I always had huge modifications in place to where, let's just say it was a modified tag game. They would take a knee, but the way they get back in is if someone on their team tags them back in, or if they do a specific fitness activity to get back in. That's just another quick modification you can put in to make it more appropriate than inequitable and inappropriate.
Yeah, I like that. So maybe we can continue to talk a little bit about what some accommodations would be, because we don't want to send the message that some of our students and some of our favorite old school elimination games need to be tossed out. We just simply need to modify them a little bit. So I like your example of the tag game. So one thing that I've seen teachers do is they'll put a list of exercises on the board. Some teachers will even have students create that list so that it's exercises that students enjoy. And then when a student is tagged, they get to choose one of their favorite exercises off of that list on the board, just do a quick 5 reps, and then they jump right back into the game, and now they're, back collaborating and participating with their peers.
Yeah, I like that. Definitely more student voice, student choice. And I mean, I know you mentioned this in your book, but that is a distinguished behavior once a student is more owning their learning and the teacher's facilitating.
It is, yeah. We do like to include as much student voice as we can. Thanks for the book plug. I appreciate that. I'm not very good at doing that myself. One thing that I do want to mention too, with the student choice of activity to jump back into a game, I don't want anybody to think that that's using exercise as punishment. I think that there's a big difference between telling a student that they have to do X number of push-ups when they get tagged, as opposed to when you get tagged, choose 3 or 5, reps of your favorite exercise, do them real quick, and then get back into the game. Do you have any thoughts on that? Would you classify it as exercise as punishment?
No, I wouldn't, but it's interesting because I didn't even think about that until you brought it up, and I can easily see how that might be misconstrued with some folks where more of the exercise as punishment, that's where a student knows they did something bad or negative, and then they're now knowing, okay, I have to do push-ups because I misbehaved. Where in this case, the exercise is more infused into a modified rule of the game, and it's a re-entry task back into the game. But yeah, that's interesting you thought of that, and I can certainly see how some people might interpret it as, well, now we're having kids exercise because they got out of a game.
Yeah, I thought of that, but I didn't really think of the answer the way that you worded it. And I think that that's perfect. It's re-entering the game and student choice as opposed to doing something wrong, right? And like righting a wrong. I think that's such a great comparison to make. One other one, when we think about outdated practices, I don't know how many folks are still doing this. I know that in DPS, I almost never see this, maybe once a year. The next outdated practice that I could think of is captains picking teams. And it kind of connects to what you were talking about earlier. I think one of the solutions, which is maybe in some cases having students self-select where they might want to go. But maybe first we could just talk about what might be the emotional impact on students when captains are picking teams. Yeah, what thoughts do you have on that outdated practice?
It's interesting because I see of this a lot even on social media where people think it's okay, and um I don't want to disagree with anybody, but from my personal standpoint, I think it's very inappropriate, and I always put my feet into the shoes of the lower level skilled students where if I know I'm no good at basketball, odds are everyone in the class has already seen me and they know I struggle with basketball. So I'm already going to know I'm going to be one of the last ones picked. And that's almost a humiliating feeling. It's public shame where if in your case, if I can pick a team I want to be on or pick what kind of competitiveness I want to do, that's so much better. Or what if a teacher chooses teams based on ability level? That way nobody knows but the teacher what ranking I was assigned.
Yeah, I like both of those ideas. With a little bit of prep and some background knowledge, a teacher can place students in situations where they know that they'll have a higher likelihood of being successful. I also think too of, even if a student is able to overcome that they were one of the last people picked on a team, once they get into that game, what is the likelihood of that student being an equal member, right? Of having an equitable experience on that team. Generally speaking, the captain is probably going to have 2 or 3 other very high skilled students, and they're going to want to pass the ball to each other, and they're going to want to take the majority of the shots. So I think that even if the student is on the team and doesn't appear to be affected by that draft, I think there's still going to be an impact once they start playing the game.
Definitely. And even And let's just say for some folks out there, they think captains are okay. Again, speaking of equity, though, what can they do to make it more equitable? And maybe a rule in place is everyone must catch a pass before someone on your team shoots. Even in that case, where I'm not condoning captains by any means, but that's something that you can certainly put in place that's super easy, that can at least give some of the lower level skilled students feel like they belong and are a part of the team.
Yeah, another great example of differentiation and how we can provide a more equitable experience to students. All right, Bri, how about this question? So some teachers will say, are you expecting me to offer different challenges for each student in my class to help them all find success? So how can a teacher be equitable and reasonable at the same time? Do you expect a teacher to provide 35 different challenges for 35 different students?
Not at all. And I'm the first to say that's so unrealistic. And you do that for a week and you're already burnt out. So when I was planning my lessons, I always almost had two different extensions in place from the get go. I thought of my full blown athletes and I thought about my students who aren't really physically active or skilled in sports. I would start there. And then from there, a lot of the time the students will almost differentiate on their own to what is productive struggle for them. But I'm always a big fan of differentiating on the spot when you see specific kids or groups doing something. So you start with two, and then from there you can rear off into many different extensions for specific skill levels or what you're seeing as evidence to where they're meeting the objective. So start really big and then get much smaller as you release the students into activity.
Yeah, there's two things that I really liked from that. One is using what you notice from the students, so what you observe from students in order to make future modifications. And when we go back to student voice, that could be a way to ask students to advocate for themselves. If you notice that students are struggling in a certain game, we could always ask kids, what rules would you like to modify for this game in order for you to be more successful? That's actually here in Colorado. That's one of our social skills standards. I think it's in middle school somewhere, probably one that you're familiar with. I think it's like 8th grade maybe, where it talks about students being able to advocate for themselves and make request various modifications to games in order to experience more success.
Along those lines, and I know we talked about this, it's more of putting ownership on the student and then the teacher is facilitating. And I know a question coming up is more like getting teachers comfortable with that. But what do you think, Gary?
From the student perspective or teacher?
Let's start teacher. Like, how do we get teachers to feel more comfortable of them accepting the fact that it's okay if an administrator walks into the gym and they might be seeing 3 or 4 different things going on? A lot of my former colleagues, they thought that wasn't right because they felt like everyone had the same objective to meet, so they needed to do the same task. I disagree with that, but what do you think?
Yeah, I've had a similar experience too, where I've helped teachers plan lessons where they're heavily differentiated for the needs of their students, and they've gotten feedback from their building leaders. Again, this is pretty rare, but this is an experience that I know teachers have, where the building leader or their instructional coach has said something like, "You shouldn't have, 3 or 4 groups of students doing different things. Students all need to be engaged in the same activity in order for them to make progress towards the objective." And I think you and I just know that that's not quite true.
No, it's not. And it's even at like professional sports. I'm a big baseball fan. And even if you go to a Rockies game, you're going to see every player doing a different task leading up to their batting practice. They're all working towards the same thing, but the process and tasks can be entirely different.
Yeah. Is it hard to get Rockies tickets these days, Bry?
Some people can't even give them away at this point.
Those that season ticket package you bought was a poor investment, I think, huh?
Yeah, it was. I think in like 2040 though, the return might be pretty high.
Okay, nice. That's good. Let's shift over to the teacher side of things. So we've detailed what it looks like and it feels like for students to be a part of an equitable PE experience, one that's heavily differentiated. How do we make teachers feel comfortable with that level of differentiation? What if we have a teacher who's, a little bit reluctant to offer several different options or take in student voice?
Again, for me personally, but I think this is a very good best practices, you've got to set the tone early on in the semester of making students realize that everyone's different and they are all have different ability levels and they're on their own individual journey, which that's one thing I do love about the creation of new the Shape America standards is it's no longer really outcome based, it's more process and progression based. So if I'm at progression 1, that's okay because I'm working towards progression 2 to 3, and if I'm really highly level skilled, then the teacher's going to come in and almost create additional progressions, but it's more of building a solid learning environment because once a student feels comfortable, I truly feel like the student will do the work for the teacher and come up with equitable ways on how to make them highly engaged. Another thing is, again, listen to your students. I always like to give students many self assessment opportunities. And I never had an instance where a student was lying or not honest with themselves to where they think they're currently at with a skill progression. And a lot of times, even if I had students say, hey, we're doing a competitive game, we're doing a semi-pro game, and we're doing a rookie game, very rarely did I have a student select into the wrong type of game where I would have put them anyways. So it's just building the community, but also getting students comfortable with having them pick and choose the avenue they want to go down.
I like that proactive approach. So I guess part of this would be convincing the teacher about the impact that this type of differentiation is going to have on their PE culture.
Absolutely. And again, it just goes like, even in my coaching days, I might have 2 varsity studs on the field, but they want to go about, let's just say, working on their curveballs in 2 different ways. And one way is not better than the other way. I would say they're both correct because they both came up with it and they know themselves better than anybody does. So why not give them the power to do that?
Yeah, I like that. I think another piece would be trying to have a reluctant teacher see it through the eyes of their students as well. Knowing that some students might feel uncomfortable, I'm just not sure that some teachers spend too much time reflecting on that. They think that the approach to PE just should be this like pretty standardized and regulation game situation. And I think that if we adjust our approach a little bit. And I think, this is the approach that, again, this is just our opinion, right? This is the approach that you and I are recommending. The end goal of a successful PE program really shouldn't be regulation games, whether it's basketball or ultimate frisbee or whatever. It should be, in my opinion, at least highly modified games where students are able to select an entry point and experience success and feel comfortable and challenged at the same time. So I think sharing that with a reluctant teacher might maybe get them to make some of those adjustments.
No, I agree. And it even goes back to what we've talked about, modifying the rules. You can have a normal basketball game, but to your point, it needs to be modified, specifically the rules, so that everybody has an equitable opportunity to be successful and achieve that day's objective.
All right, so that we can answer this one together. So one of the things that we both advocate for, and again, we've kind of touched on this because these topics are all so intertwined, differentiation and equitable experiences. We advocate for small-sided games versus large team games. We know that if we were going to play a regulation flag football game, that would be like 11 kids playing against each other. And that's not really an equitable learning experience. So why do we think that small-sided games are an effective strategy? Why are they more equitable? And then how might we, well, we've kind of already touched on that, how we might set up our learning environment in order to match that philosophy.
To me, the easy answer is small-sided games versus large-sided games. You're going to get more movement. And our jobs as PE teachers, again, we've got to keep the students active. Of course, we're teaching and there's learning taking place at the same time, but you're much more likely to be engaged and be getting the ball on a team of 4 versus a team of 11. So big one for me is they've got to stay moving. But again, the smaller your team is, the better chance you're going to have of being successful and being more engaged to where you can work on the skills that are being taught.
Yeah, you've brought up coaching a few times too, and a lot of people I think can relate to those experiences, because when you're coaching, you want to get students the most amount of reps during the small amount of practice time that you have. We don't want students or baseball players or basketball players out there standing around on the field and on the court, or being in drills where they only touch the ball once or twice a minute. We want maximal reps for the amount of time that we have students. So when we have small-sided team games, it just it means that students are going to get more opportunities to be engaged and be physically active and practice the skills that we want them to learn.
No, that you couldn't have said that any better. I completely agree. And again, it's all about mastering the objective and again finding yourself in the journey where you think you're at. And again, lack of repetitions, it's obvious you're not gonna get enough practice to make a dent into what the end goal is.
Let's do one or two more questions, I think. So this one, Bri, how do you assure all students, regardless of gender and ethnicity, are given opportunities to meet daily objectives?
That's a good question. I think we can take that in so many different ways, but primarily for me, I think learning environment plays a key role in this. Students need to feel comfortable, and a big thing that teachers can do to preface that is having daily rituals and routines to where the learning environment is predictable. They're always going to know what to expect, but also whether it's your classroom management strategies, consequences, whatever it is, they need to be fair, firm, and consistent. Again, with the end goal of the students are always going to know what's expected of them. And another thing is, it sounds easy, but a lot of times the reflection piece I think is missing is when you're planning a lesson, you can't just plan the lesson with your highly level skilled students in mind. You need to think of all students. So a lot of times I would almost plan a lesson with some of my lower level skilled students in mind first, because I've always thought it's easier to differentiate up sometimes than it is down. And you've got to know where some of your students are coming from. Socioeconomic status, gender, race, what maybe some of their personal traumatic experience have been. And if you can really factor that thinking into your planning, the rest is just going to take care of itself.
I really like how you approach this question from the learning environment perspective, because we've talked so much about equitable environments and how to differentiate activities, how to modify them and extend them. It's so important that students have that predictable learning environment, like you mentioned. I think that when the expectations are clearly communicated and they're consistent throughout the year, and the teacher holds students accountable to them, we really are setting students up from all backgrounds to be successful when it comes to their learning.
Absolutely. And that's just what my first thoughts were to that question. I know you support like 50 to 100 teachers a year. How often do you see elimination games or inequitable practices in place to where students who need activity the most are usually removed first? And then answer that, and then there's kind of a second component to that.
I think luckily in DPS, we don't see all that many inequitable practices anymore. I think that our teachers try really hard to make sure that all students are comfortable and welcome in their classroom and that they have opportunities to engage in the activities. I think what I would see the most are like unintentional inequitable practices, not that the teacher has planned it purposefully on that way, but so like an example would be kind of similar to what we talked about with small-sided team games. Like, let's say we're in elementary and there's a relay race that's happening and there's 8 kids in each line. All right, we know that there's going to be a lot of wait time, that students aren't going to get the amount of reps that they need in order to remain active and practice their skills throughout the lesson. So it's not quite an elimination game, but I would say that wait time is probably the most common inequitable practice I see. And again, it's usually just a really quick fix of asking the teacher to put themselves in the shoes of those students. And the funny thing too is oftentimes there will be a teacher will ask a question like, there were kids just messing around and showing off-task behaviors, right? They were being disruptive at the back of the line. What recommendations do you have for me to fix some of those disruptive behaviors? And you could just ask them, well, I mean, what would you do if you were waiting eight people deep in a line? I mean, we have to do it as adults, right? We get to the supermarket and we see that there's 7 people in front of us, and we want to rip everything off the shelves and be disruptive. So what would you do if you were 8 years old and you had to wait 2 minutes to get your turn to do a 15-second activity relay race or whatever it is? So I think that would be the most inequitable practice I see. But again, it's a pretty easy fix.
So other than like recommending the teachers put themselves in the student shoes, I mean, what do you think is most effective, or even other effective ways you can recommend in trying to encourage teachers to try new activities or try different teaching practices to where it's more differentiating the environment to get them to understand that all students need to be the same in terms of activity levels, instruction, and all that good stuff?
I think another approach to that could be evidence that we have that students are making progress towards the objective. So when we think about it from, again, it's coming from the student perspective, which I think is an important piece to continue to highlight. When we think about evidence of students either physically demonstrating progress towards the objective or using language to articulate that they understand the concept that they're learning for the day, asking teachers what evidence they have of that. And I think that when we see some of these inequitable practices that we've been talking about, we usually end up with a lack of evidence because students didn't have the opportunity to engage in the skill, multiple times, or students didn't have an opportunity to communicate with a partner about their learning. Instead, they were deep in line for an activity, or they were in a large group activity or game where they very rarely got to showcase their skills. So that's the first thing that comes to mind. Do you have any thoughts on that one?
No, I mean, I think it's just doing whatever it takes to get teachers to realize what if they were that student or those students. And I mean, it sounds super easy, but any teacher, regardless if you're in year 1 or year 35, they're going to know and be able to reflect that, yeah, something needs changed here in this situation.
Yeah, I can share with you an experience that I had that was pretty impactful, and I try to share it with teachers too, because I think just the story itself helps a lot of teachers realize what it's like to be in student shoes. So I work on as you know, Brian, I work on a small team of 7 instructional coaches, and we all support various teachers and building leaders throughout Denver Public Schools. One year we were brought in, a principal asked us to come into her school, and we each got assigned a student, and we had, I think it was like 8 or 10 different criteria that we were looking for. So it was like, how many times was the student called on in class? How many times did the student talk to a partner? Did the student display any disruptive behavior? Did the student have their head down on their desk, etc.? And it was kind of cool because they like brought us out into the hallway and they were like, "Hey, Gary, see that kid over there with the red shirt on? That's your guy. Go follow him around." And the kid didn't know until like the third period, maybe, where the kid turned around and asked me, "Mister, are you following me?" And I was like, "Yeah, actually, I am following you today." But it was an incredible experience to be able to see, what students experience as they move throughout their classes. And this kid didn't get called on. He made it through third period without having to say a word to any of his peers or his teachers. And when we debriefed together as a team after that, we kind of shared very similar experiences. So I think even sharing a story like that was something that was impactful for me. Sharing that with other teachers can get them to really put themselves in student shoes and see the lesson as students experience it.
That's a good point, because a lot of time it's never intentional by the
No.
teacher. It's just they're not aware of it. Where I remember one class, I had cold called all boys. I didn't once ask a female student, and I didn't know I was doing it until I really sat back and reflected. It's just being more cognizant of it. Easier said than done, of course, but I just want people to understand that we all do it, and most of the time it's not intended at all. It's just sometimes you got to be called out for you to be more aware of it.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, I didn't mean at all to assume that teachers were doing it on purpose, but you're totally right. Sometimes it's just not something that we're aware of. One of the other inequitable practices that I see often are, and it goes back to the discussion that we've been having about dividing students up, whether it be into small groups or teams for a game. There are still some teachers who will divide students up by gender, right? All the boys on the blue line, all the girls on the red line, and here's the game we're going to play today. Is that an equitable practice in your opinion? Is that something that we would recommend that teachers use, or do we have other strategies for dividing students up?
Honestly, Gary, I can argue for that both ways, but the most important thing is at times I did split them up by gender, but I would only do it if both the girls and the boys were okay with it, and they would also understand why I, as the teacher, felt like it was appropriate in that situation. But most of the time, it isn't equitable. And one of the things I always like to do is there's so many apps out there where you can assign every student an ability level, and the apps will automatically create teams for you, and you can say equal gender teams, equal ability teams, and that way the app is doing the teams, the teacher's not. I always just hit the button, the students saw that, and then they would see the teams. But in certain situations, like some units, sometimes girls would come up to me and say, "Can we just do an all girls game?" And if all of the girls in the class were okay with it, I allowed it. But if there were some girls that wanted to be with the boys, for example, I would let them go over there. It was just more about the personal comfort. And again, to me, if a student is able to differentiate and know that this game is way beyond my ability, in this case, I think it is appropriate to split them up by gender. So a lot of times I think it depends on the certain situation, but overall, my general response would be no, there's more equitable ways out there to get students into teams.
Mm, yeah, I mean, it is a difficult topic to consider these days. One thing that I like about what you said was just the transparency behind it. So even if you did decide that day to split students up by gender, it was you had a reason for it, and you were open and honest with kids about it. So I really do appreciate that. One concern that I have, one worry is again, going back to the student perspective, are there going to be any students in class who just might feel uncomfortable by that? And when I think about that alone, it almost makes me want to just shy away from it. It doesn't seem to me that using gender to divide students up into groups or teams is worth it. If we think about a student who that might potentially make feel uncomfortable in our PE culture. So that's just kind of my approach where I land on that one.
Well, and I certainly can't argue that either. And one of the fail safes is almost like using the app. And then if
Mm.
you felt like one student needed to be moved, that can be more of an individual conversation. And you can move a student to another team or game without anyone else even realizing it. So I do think that would be the most appropriate and equitable practice. I'm just kind of piggybacking off what you were saying.
Yeah, yeah. Like I said, I mean, I am kind of in that gray area, but and I promise we're not going to talk about this because we don't have all night. But I kind of take the same approach to dodgeball, where it's like, look, I don't care that certain kids really love it, right? I don't even want to get into the specifics of it. The only thing I care about is that we just have better techniques at this point, right? We have better ways to split kids up into groups, and we have better activities to play if we want to teach skills like throwing and chasing and fleeing and dodging, etc. So whether or not somebody feels it's an effective approach, in my opinion, I'm just like, I just don't think I'm gonna touch it. I'm just gonna use one of our other effective approaches and kind of avoid it altogether.
And like one of the last things I would just interject with is again, dodgeball. I've never been a fan. I never will be a fan, but we've talked about just easy ways to modify for equity purposes. You can still do a dodgeball type game, but instead of throwing balls at a person, maybe they're throwing them at cones or bowling pins. Again, there's still too much standing around for me, but if somebody was so stuck on there's nothing wrong with dodgeball, well, another equitable way around that is okay, instead of throwing some objects at a person, throw them at an object, and then that way no one's getting eliminated and they can still work on skills.
Yeah, I like that one. There was a hula hoop activity that I saw a couple of years ago. It still falls under the category of using students as targets. So, I might not be completely sold on it. It might not be a game that I recommend, but as an alternative to dodgeball, I do think it is great. So there are just a number of hula hoops on the ground, and if you kick a hula hoop, it doesn't fly up in the air. It just slides across the gym floor. So what ends up happening is it just hits students in the feet as they're running around their general space in the gym. Again, we want to make sure that that's not an elimination game, that if a student does get hit in the foot with a hula hoop, that they have some sort of activity that they can do in order to jump back in the game. But I always like that one, although I do know that it kind of sits on both sides of the fence as far as using students as targets.
For sure. And again, it's just trying to put yourself in the shoes of maybe the least athletic student in the class. And if it makes you even think twice of how would they think, maybe they're going to feel bad, we shouldn't be doing it. Or we need to find an alternative to that activity to where maybe 95% of the class is okay with it, but what about that 5%? And again, back to what I said earlier, when I planned, I would almost plan for that 5% first, because the other students, I would know if it was a competitive class, they're going to be fine. No matter what modification I put in place, they're going to roll with it.
I think that's probably my biggest takeaway from today is to approach lesson planning and to approach instructional methods through the eyes of all of your students, especially the ones who might be brand new to a game or the ones who might have a lower skill level than other games. What about you, Brian? You got a takeaway from today?
I mean, mine would be very similar. Again, mine is again we talked about equality and equity, and just knowing that a lot of things we're already doing in terms of differentiating and maintaining a high level of rigor, that is equitable. And it's just getting you to understand that we're not reinventing the wheel here. It's just be more cognizant of maybe one small adjustment can even skyrocket the equity versus inequity in your class.
Yeah, I agree. Hey, Brian, that was a great conversation on equitable practices and differentiation in physical education. Let's finish up with one last thing. Let's talk about our Facebook group, because we have such a great community there. We have teachers who have been teaching for decades. We have experts like yourself in this group. We have instructional curriculum specialists and building leaders who all have some sort of background in PE. Can you speak of what you think makes our Facebook group, Distinguished Physical Education, a little bit different than maybe some of the other ones?
Yeah, for sure. Again, not to knock any of the other groups because they're great in their own ways. I think one of the biggest difference in the distinguished PE group versus some of the others is we like to dialogue real world problems. We still share fun games and activities, but we're more about the why and the pedagogy and the true learning that's either taking place or should take place. We're um, able to provide feedback to each other. One member of the group, I remember he got feedback from one member, and then a week later, he kind of shared how the feedback went after he was receptive to it, and it went well. So I think it's more pedagogy versus, hey, what's the next best tag game out there to keep my students busy?
Yeah, that was a really cool moment, like being asked for feedback from someone, not in Denver. I don't remember where that person lived, but for them to, be so engaged in our conversation and then to come back and share with us the impact that it had on their life. I think that was super cool. And yeah, I'm with you. There's a lot of PE Facebook groups out there, and they all offer something, right? We just want to offer something a little bit different. I think there's an opportunity for us out there to offer the instructional methods side of things, as opposed to maybe leaning heavily on activities and other types of things like some other groups do. So we'll just invite folks to search on Facebook for Distinguished Physical Education and come join us.
And I do think once people start kind of engaging in the group, I can confidently say that they're kind of seeing a big difference between ours and some of the other ones. And there's a lot of true learning taking place, and people are vulnerable and they kind of just talk about what's going on in their PE classes, and they're not embarrassed about it because we all know we're all in these situations.
Yeah, well said. Brian Hall, it was a pleasure speaking with you today.